We've had some computer glitches, but it seems like we're all up and running except for our PowerPoint. So we're working on that part. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Claire Strom, and I'm a professor. I was going to say here, but I guess that is not a very accurate word at Rollins College in Orlando. I'm actually not working on Southern history right now. I'm writing a global history of cattle called Cattle and Class Warfare. So kind of deep in Africa right now. But we have three wonderful presenters and three papers about the Southern Range. Our first presenter is changed. It's going to be Erin Stewart Mauldin, who is an environmental historian and an assistant professor of history at the University of South Florida, so just across the peninsula in Tampa. Her 2019 book, Unredeemed Land, An Environmental History of the Civil War and Emancipation in the Cotton South, was designated a Choice Outstanding Academic title. She also co-edited the Companion to Global Environmental History and currently serves as the co-editor of the University of Georgia's Environmental History in the American South book series, which I'm very fond of. And she is the book review editor for Agricultural History, which I'm also very fond of. So without further ado, I'm going to mute and turn this over to Erin.
All right. Thank you so much, Claire. And I'm really happy to hear about your current project because my paper uses sort of a comparative lens on the U.S. Southern Range and Africa. So maybe in the Q&A, you can sort of help guide me a little bit because I'm a bit of an interloper, not an expert at all. Okay, so I do not have a PowerPoint, which is why I'm going first so that maybe we can figure it out for the other two presenters. So I'm just going to read in sort of typical conference fashion. During the 18th and 19th centuries, many Southern hog and cattle raisers in what we know as the South and even up into what a Civil War historian would call the border states, they engaged in free-range animal husbandry, which allowed their animals to graze on common lands or in woodland or old fields for much of the year. And historians of the U.S. South have written a lot about this subject, and particularly they are interested in the class, the racial, or the ideological conflicts that resulted from this practice, particularly as it related to the social and economic issues surrounding the Civil War, so the late antebellum period or the Reconstruction era. However, what I don't see in this literature a lot is the Southern Range's global context. Scholars have recently begun to talk about how the U.S. South was not really an isolated system, but rather one piece of an interconnected industrial capitalist network of commodity-driven agriculture that stretched across the world. And the debates over the existence and the use of the open range in the U.S. South, particularly during the Civil War era, often paralleled and sometimes inspired colonial rhetoric about and responses to similar practices in Africa, where livestock control policies reflected concerns about race and economic power and white expertise in agricultural development as much as they did land use. Furthermore, the gradual transformation of the open range in the South through the use of stock laws or labor contracts, railroad policies, and other means mirrored similar colonial agricultural developmental policies in places such as present-day Togo, Malawi, Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, and South Africa over the subsequent decades. And here I'm referring to a really dynamic set of literature by people like Andrew Zimmerman and Frederick Cooper, Joseph Morgan Hodge, and Andrew Bowman. So just to demonstrate the usefulness of considering the Southern Range within this sort of larger global context, I'm going to talk about hog cholera in the U.S. South. If you've heard me speak at any conference over the last 7 years, I've probably mentioned hog cholera because it's one of my favorite subjects that I've studied in writing my book. And in my book, I talk about hog cholera in reference to its role in reducing subsistence practices for freed people in the Deep South, But what I'd like to do today is not just think about this topic within the confines of Southern history, but also to think about the connections between Reconstruction era events on the one hand, and the broader narrative of Western development and occupation of colonial lands across the global South during the 19th and 20th centuries. So really, it's this network of ideas regarding the improvement of lands and peoples. So in the wake of the Civil War hog cholera epizootic, people in the US proposed scientific agriculture to cure the South's biological control of hog cholera. And local whites seized upon this advice, and veterinary science became part of the argument for planters' control of the subsistence of ex-slaves or landless whites who clung to more traditional methods of agriculture. This was very similar to some of the rhetoric about the control of animal diseases on the range throughout Southern Africa. Just as in the US, agricultural commissioners, medical officials, white politicians, they used outbreaks of animal disease in colonies to justify the restructuring of what they saw as chaotic or wasteful traditional land raising or livestock raising practices. So across the 19th century South, I sort of see this story, right? The seemingly straightforward issue of animal husbandry, access to common land, and animal disease. They were often used as an opportunity to raise other concerns about racial demarcations, economic development, and questions of civilization. And so what I hope to do with this, it really isn't part of a larger project or anything, more of something I ran into in writing other things. But I'm hoping that sort of taking a bigger view, we can see that the transformation of the open range after the Civil War in the South was not so much a parochial issue, but part of a global conversation about the integration of traditional or indigenous natural economies into more capitalistic intensive systems that favored white elites. So I want to start with hog cholera real briefly. Hog cholera is a highly contagious hemorrhagic fever. It causes healthy swine to stop eating or drinking. They vomit a lot. They seize until they die, increasingly emaciated. Mortality rates run to about 70%, and the disease wasn't eradicated in the US until 1978. It was inadvertently imported into the US during the antebellum period, but the lower and coastal Souths remained relatively untouched until the Civil War. As Army quartermasters gathered together animals of varying immunity and moved them from one place to another, you have the ideal conditions for a region-wide epizootic. And the Civil War hog cholera outbreak began in the border states like Kentucky, and then followed the Union Army into the Confederate heartland and out to places like Arkansas and Texas through, army purchasing, through stockyards, railroad cars, things like that. Now, during the war, the disease's appearance sparked a desperate search for a cure. Most of the suggestions would be horrifying to a 21st century reader, like putting arsenic or strychnine in your hog's food would fix it, keeping them without water for up to 6 weeks, which I can't imagine that would fix anything. Putting tar and grease in equal measures down their throats was an antidote. But hog cholera didn't disappear after the Civil War was over, and outbreaks occurred every few years in most states. By this point, you have the development of the USDA and the Bureau of Animal Industry and other federal agencies that are paying attention to the former Confederacy. And during the 1870s, what you see is, what had been really random, really divergent, sometimes laughable prescriptions for controlling hog cholera sort of coalesced around a common theme, which was that livestock in the South simply were not cared for properly, and that leaving them to fend for themselves in the woods was improper, backward, and weakened animals' constitutions. And so to halt the disease, the USDA, editors of Southern agricultural publications, and other sort of officials floating around pushed for a more intensive, more modern stock raising system. They used a mixture of quarantines, checkpoints, fencing, physical control of hogs' movement and care rather than biological control of the virus, which they didn't quite understand yet. Another way to try to prevent the spread of hog cholera was replacing the breeds of hogs common in the South at the time with supposedly more improved ones, more immunologically stable breeds, mostly from the North or from England. And that was seen as a way of preventing additional outbreaks. And, this sort of intensive penning your livestock, feeding them corn, using breeds that have more fat on them. That might have worked in some regions, but in a lot of places in the South that ran up against environmental conditions, lack of capital among farmers, and really a problem with how intensive farming worked when sharecropping and tenancy were on the rise. So why would Southern farmers listen to the USDA? It's not clear that they did, at least in any way that we can measure as historians now. However, the timing of the debates over the control of hog cholera did coincide with the height of political interest in the subject of the South's open range. And you have, white landowners being the audience for publications coming out from both the federal government and state agencies about farming. And you also have the problem of emancipation. After the freeing of the South's 4 million slaves, the idea of the open range sort of became entangled with the region's upended racial hierarchies. And so the idea was that if you restricted common lands and free range grazing, that you would also increase tenants and sharecroppers and other landless farmers' dependency on plantations for their subsistence. Between 1865 and 1890, states across the Deep South passed laws that either prohibited animals running at large or gave individual counties the right to decide whether or not animals should be penned. And at the same time, it became increasingly common for landowners to prohibit their tenants and sharecroppers to keep livestock, supposedly for fear of the disease to spreading to owners' animals, or, to make sure that the disease is not introduced into the farm. And so one of the primary results of hog cholera was a reduction in the self-sufficiency of poorer farmers throughout the South. However, hog cholera was part of a much larger story of a global history of animal disease consolidating or sometimes subverting white power, particularly in regions whose economies relied on agricultural or mining exports produced by people of color. The spread of animal diseases through trade among North America, Africa, Australia, Europe, and Asia during the 19th century often hampered European-led commercial economic development, but also threatened native autonomy from the Xhosa tribes of Southern Africa, even through the Navajo. And attempts to control animal disease were never really a matter of marshaling sufficient scientific understanding, as Richard Waller writes, and solutions for infectious outbreaks were often more about controlling the livestock owners rather than the animals or the disease itself. So one of the narratives that I found that really sort of closely related to how hog cholera ended up going in the South was the Great African Rinderpest epizootic of the 1890s. And you see a lot of the rhetoric about rinderpest and ways to control it sort of mirroring what you see in the South a few decades before. So rinderpest is another highly contagious virus spread by close contact within a herd. And it was not endemic to most of Africa prior to the 1890s. And it infects ruminants of all types, from cattle to water buffalo through yaks and wildebeest. Infected animals display fever and depression and decreased appetite, low milk yield, congestion. They get oral lesions. Their breath gets really, really bad. And rinderpest was really well known in Europe prior to their scramble for Africa because it had claimed millions of cattle across Europe and Asia for centuries. And Europeans had a standard of how to deal with rinderpest, but when rinderpest was spread during the 1890s in Africa, they didn't immediately identify it as the rinderpest that they knew on the European continent because so many animals other than cattle were also dying. And so that sort of led to a delay in the response. But the results of the rinderpest epizootic were absolutely devastating. In Ethiopia, it was said that only one or two out of every 1,000 cattle were spared. And from sort of northeast Africa, it spread south and west. So again, officials believed that better borders would stop the disease's spread. Like in the US, ecological conditions made sort of free-range animal grazing more sensible than stationary cattle farms throughout much of the continent. However, traditional African pastoralist practices clashed with European notions of what enlightened stock raising looked like. And European officials believed that commissioning large-scale fencing projects would help control the spread of rinderpest. They divided African-held cattle from European cattle. They stopped trade between unaffected and infected areas. And they also used fencing to prevent Africans from moving their cattle to new grazing lands. And some of these methods were really, really expensive. And you can see that in sort of the reports of colonial stations throughout Southern Africa. But they were also largely ineffective, given the nature of the African landscape and its cattle economy. However, Europeans thought that by increasingly penning African cattle, that they were actually improving herders' way of life. And so once again, class, race, and the interests of the economy meant that rinderpest control solutions also favored European property and ideas of proper livestock raising over more nomadic African herds. Sometimes colonial officials would shoot entire herds of African-held cattle called preventative slaughter. And while they would shoot cattle of Europeans, colonists as well, it didn't happen as often. And you see this again in the colonial reports where there are a lot of complaints from the indigenous people that colonial officials are just going around shooting their cattle. Also, you see European disparagement of African veterinary knowledge and racialized understandings of African agricultural abilities, and these things also complicated the disease response. Veterinary departments established rinderpest camps where Europeans could learn how to inoculate their cattle against rinderpest. And then the white farmers were supposed to relay the technique to African pastoralists. And there are historians who have shown that these programs were not really about controlling rinderpest, but an attempt by the state to slot Africans into their worldview and to replace African livestock management techniques with European ones. Sort of skipping ahead for time. And so what you see in Africa after this devastating epidemic is that responses to rinderpest revealed a multitude of fissures in the colonial project, especially where large numbers of European cattle raisers clashed with African pastoralists. And colonial officials argued that more intensive stock raising practices using cattle mostly from Europe would create healthier herds. And this echoes the breakdown of practices between Southern white elites and poorer Southerners, and especially African Americans in the South. And you see African pastoralism, which was extensive and relied on open grazing, being slowly replaced by settler stock raising, which was more intensive and fixed. So I don't really, again, have any plans for this beyond what I have. But I think it's really interesting, and I'm glad that Claire is working on this because there is a story about the histories of the US South and colonial Africa and other places in the 19th century being intertwined in a variety of ways. And one of those is sort of this transnational history of debates over the proper way to raise livestock amid waves of animal disease. And competing patterns of knowledge often meant that the cure for or rhetoric about these diseases reflected class or racial divides as much as any particular scientific advice. And so I think animal disease is a window, albeit an imperfect one, into some of the fault lines that fragmented a variety of colonial projects in livestock raising economies across the world, from the nascent European regimes of sub-Saharan Africa to the post-war U.S. South. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Erin. I was just writing about rinderpest yesterday, so that was great. It was good to hear some of those names and your take on the story. We are going to see if our PowerPoint's working. No, still not working. I have a grayed out button. Debbie, what do you want to do?
I'll go forward and try to explain the data that won't be on the screen. It's not the first time we've had a technical glitch, right? So we'll just roll with it.
That's true. Thank you. Our next speaker is Deborah Liles, who is the W.K. Gordon Chair of Texas History at Tarleton State University in Stevensville, Texas. She is author of multiple articles and book chapters that examine slavery, women, ranching, and the Texas frontier. Recent books include 3 co-edited anthologies: Women in Civil War Texas, Texas Women and Ranching, and African Americans in Central Texas History. 2 monographs in progress examine the correlation between small slaveholders and ranching in Texas, and the biography of one of those men, Oliver Loving. Okay, do we want to try that?
I'm just going to go forward, and like I said, I'll try and explain my data, and well, hopefully people can think geographically and think lots of numbers, and I'll just try and do the very best I can without those.
I'm sure it will be wonderful. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. And thank you, Claire, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this session. I'm really looking forward to hearing the questions and answers after we present our papers. So I am not quite as prepared to look at the screen as Erin was, so please forgive me while I read my paper. The end of the Mexican-American War is given credit for an increased settlement throughout Texas, but it was the California gold rush that spurred frontier development and a demand for slaves during the 1850s. The cattle and horse-rich region created a magnet that savvy stockmen knew would generate phenomenal profits. With families and friends, raisers, herders, and traders migrated to Texas from the United States and Europe, but primarily from the Upper South, where small slave owners raised and sold livestock to the Lower South. The smallest fraction of frontier settlers, normally less than 20% of the tax-paying population, duplicated the proven formula of owning fewer slaves than their planter contemporaries in order to raise livestock in lieu of cash crops. Through kinship, friendship, and business ties, these men and women created a microcosm in slavery along the westernmost frontier of the Old South. The geographical topic of this paper is the Northwestern frontier, defined as Tarrant County, which is where Fort Worth is, to the Red River, which is the top of Texas, and west to the 100th meridian, which is the down line from the Panhandle area. But more accurately ended at the boundary of Young and Stevens counties, as no organized local administrations existed from farther west. This region was not unique by any means, but a repetition of what had occurred throughout the width and breadth of the Old South, from the Carolinas to Texas, posited in the 1920s as the terminus for the institution of slavery by Charles Ramsdale et al. It was determined unprofitable for plantation slavery, thus a futile destination for anyone who invested in slaves. Ramsdale and other historians did not and have not, however, examined the profitability of slavery in the livestock industry, a vastly different structure than plantation slavery. In a time of open range ranching, vast swaths of lands and large slave holdings were unnecessary due to endless pasture and reduced labor requirements. The logistics of frontier population growth after the California gold rush are simple. Before the gold rush, Californios slaughtered the cattle for their valuable hides and left their unwanted carcasses to rot. Throughout the history of America, livestock herds increased 2 ways: with or without human intervention. When not in the wild, they traversed the continent with migrating human populations and met their needs. Along with weather, disease, as in the cholera, and war, the largest intervening factor on demand including events that impetuously introduced massive populations to distant locations. One such event occurred when 100,000 plus Argonauts and associated people descended into California to capitalize on the second great American gold rush. These men, women, and children rapidly ate or worked to death once abundant livestock. A voracious market developed to fill the void, driving prices to an outrageously seductive level. As luck would have it, Texas had an abundance of wild cattle and horses along the western frontier. All that stood between the livestock raisers and vast profits were Native Americans who had not yet surrendered their livestock or their land. Cattle raisers took the chance and relocated to the Texas frontier, most frequently through cluster migrations. While they alerted officials to Native American threats, real or concocted, they petitioned for and created new counties, which required elected and appointed officials and the collection of property taxes, which is actually what I've spent the last 5 years transcribing to come up with this data. Without exception, every frontier county recorded residents and non-residents with cattle, horses, and after 1860, sheep. During initial settlement, Indian raids, referred to as depredations, occurred where Anglos claimed large livestock holdings, yet stockmen opted to remain, move into, or relocate to proximate locations rather than forego the pecuniary opportunities of the business. There were 3 distinct frontier regions in the state. Upper, referred to in this paper as the Northwestern frontier, the middle, and the lower. Important similarities exist within each, but are not limited to: horizontal movement of residents from other counties in Texas, retention of land in counties of previous residency, the consistency of slave owners occupying less than 20% of the tax-paying population until the end of the war, business partnerships, the need for female slaves over male, a preference for low slave holdings, the declarations of a higher percentage of slave owners' property than their percent of the population, cluster migrations of family and friends from the same communities, consistent accusations of Indians killing residents and raiding in order to manipulate authorities, and the equal opportunity that slave and non-slave owners had to profit in the livestock industry. What made each region a microcosm was the interconnectivity that existed between residents of neighboring counties and the consistency of residents of those other counties declaring movable property in counties other than the one they lived in. These 2 things, especially the latter, alter the wealth and labor pool of the small slave owners and change the perception of wealth in the Old South. This paper will briefly discuss 5 of the above things: the preference for low slave holdings, the declaration of property in counties other than that of residents, partnerships, the correlation between slavery and livestock, and the domination of higher property declarations by the livestock raising slave owners in their communities. Throughout the Northwestern frontier, statistics support that ownership of 1 to 9 slaves was the preference. These numbers are easily missed in counties without a decade or more of records, but when combined with the older counties, both in and out of the Northwestern region, the pattern is obvious. Large numbers of slaves were unnecessary to generate the profits livestock raisers sought, and so they did not invest their profits into an unneeded labor pool. And you can see as you go through the counties, this will be a set of one of the slides I had, you can see that the numbers of slaves, 1 to 4 and then 5 to 9, this is where the dominant or where the most slaves were in all of the Northwestern counties and generally down the frontier. The only exceptions seem to be for people who decided to trade slaves or towards the end of the war, of course, for refugees coming in with their slaves. The preference for low slave holdings correlates with the nature of the livestock industry. Tending livestock did not demand the same labor force throughout the year as plantation work, although stock raisers also grew crops, specifically corn and wheat. Stock raisers increased their livestock holdings through natural reproduction or acquisition, which required little, if any, human intervention, unlike producing a cash crop. Slaves breaking horses, branding cattle, tanning, processing, milking, tending cattle, horses, sheep, and hogs, feeding, castrating, and all other aspects of stock raising are well documented, and record the value of slaves' labor and dependence on their skills as they handled the most valuable property their masters owned besides themselves. Journal entries and slave narratives record not only the presence of enslaved people on cow hunts, but that some also rode horses and carried guns, a practice not seen in plantation agriculture that all by itself changes our perception of slavery. Animal husbandry is, as Elliott West succinctly stated, between people and the things their animals eat. Land clearing was not usually a problem among the Northwestern Texas frontier, as the western cross timbers, a tree formation containing primarily live oaks, formed the last of the thicker forests for hundreds of miles. Trees were and are the first to claim available nourishment from the soil, so their absence and an extended growing season meant that a thick blanket of wild grasses supplied highly nutritious year-round fodder. Because of this, frontier ranches did not often have to practice transhumance, the transfer of stock from one location to the other, to avoid overgrazing. When they did move stock or raise it elsewhere, slaves helped with this process. Stockmen chose and preferred small slave holdings other than had an inability to reach planter status. Aside from selling their slaves to preserve their holdings, they reported substantial wealth that could easily purchase more slaves if needed. Frontier county residents rarely owned more than 20 slaves, and those few with larger holdings generally did not record high number of livestock, so that match doesn't happen. There are, of course, exceptions, including Middleton Tate Johnson, who, along with Ripley Arnold, selected the location for Fort Worth. Johnson, as others did throughout the state, used his large slave force to raise livestock when it immediately proved beneficial, such as during the Civil War years. And you can see in his tax records how it'll hit in 1853, how his numbers will go up, and I'll explain that in a second. And also throughout the Civil War years, his livestock holdings jumped by 300 or 400 head to accommodate the need during the war. My second point, the declaration of property in counties other than that of residents, begins with an observation from the post-war period. Until the passage of the O'Connor Law in the 1880s, stock raisers in Texas reported their livestock where it grazed. After the enactment of the law, all livestock holdings were reported in their owner's county of residence. This new system conveniently gave us a complete record of stock wealth rather than multiple reports that are easily missed. By studying a cluster of counties such as the Northwestern, Central, or Lower Frontier regions, previously overlooked movable property is found as a researcher becomes familiar with the residents' names and family connections in the records and the perceived wealth of antebellum stock raisers and their perceived wealth. It also skews every single statistic I've calculated. Stock previously assigned to non-slave owners often belonged to slave owners from a different county. So while county totals are based on the county slave owners, the actual number of stock owned by slave owners was far greater than individual county data shows. And this may be hard to keep up without the PowerPoints, but what you can see is people living in one county and they declare all their holdings. And when you go to a different county and start transcribing those tax records, you see the same people in those counties that are adjacent. And you see that they also have livestock there. Before that O'Connor Law, those were separate and you couldn't tell how much livestock they actually owned. When the figures are combined, an entirely different version of small slave owners' wealth becomes apparent. Missed wealth from Stevens County serves as a great example. In 1864, at least 3,350 head of cattle worth $20,000 initially appeared to belong to non-slave owners, but it actually was the property of slave owners from other counties. This misallocated cattle raised the slave owners' portion of cattle holdings from 16 to 23%, or 4% more than the 3% acceptable margin of error. Isabel Eichard, for example, was from Parker County, approximately 70 miles to the east. And she owned some of that cattle in 2 different years, 519 head worth $4,000 in 1863 and 600 head worth $3,600 in 1864. There were others, including Olive Loving and Mabel Gilbert. Loving, a resident of both Parker and Palo Pinto counties, claimed property in both locations on different years. And then in 1864, he inexplicably declared $10,000 worth of livestock in Tarrant County. Gilbert moved from Clay to Montague County in 1863 to avoid Comanche attacks, but rather than take his cattle with him, he left it behind. Removing his stock from compiled statistics for Clay County results in a 6% drop in slave owners' cattle. But should it? He was still a slave owner, and the stock was still his. But accurately allocating property to slave or non-slave owners becomes a challenge, especially when they moved and left property behind, or simply declared it in a county they never intended to use for anything other than grazing. And then there were multiple partnerships. The clearest example of this was in Wise County during the Civil War. And there were at least 40 partnerships listed in Wise County of people getting together with multiple people, multiple partners to go ahead and build their livestock holdings. When county historians later wrote about the communities, they revered the noble men who remained on the home front to protect county residents during the war. But these men were hardly sacrificial lambs. The Confederate Congress not only extended exemptions to stockmen in 1862, they instigated a mandatory draft for the male population aged 18 to 35, but also exempted one man for every 500 head of cattle in a herd. This kept stock raisers at home to protect their families, property, and communities, exempted if not one of several of their family members from the battlefields, all while they profited from a legal windfall. Of the 12 heroic men mentioned by Wise County historians, only 2 or 16% were slave owners, but that falls right under that 20% that seems to be present within these frontier counties. One of these men was Absalom Bishop, who managed to more than double his land holdings, increase his personal cattle holdings by a third during this time period. This is a pittance, however, when compared to the $16,800 he and his partners scored through the war years. Bishop's partnerships also had multiple partnerships with other people, resulting in a staggering amount of wealth accumulated while the Confederate government paid soldiers from their community $12 a month to die for a cause they may or may not have believed in. The most unusual case of partnership existed between the McAdams brothers, Benjamin and Moses. The McAdams men were the only taxpayers in the Northwestern region who claimed half a slave each. There was an addition of a slave in 1855, a subtraction of one or more in 1858, and then an addition of another in 1859, and the eventual merger of their slave holdings in 1864. As the years progressed, the benefit of slave labor to the McAdams brothers partnership is obvious from the declarations. Their combined net worth of $760 in 1853 increased to $7,143 by 1864, a tidy growth of 840%. Which brings me to the fourth point of this paper, the correlation between small slave owning and the livestock industry. For this to exist, a rise in slave holdings should occur at the same time as a rise in declared livestock, and then both numbers should continue to grow throughout the years. This correlation occurs in every county, but the Denton County records offer the clearest example, as they began in 1846. Data shows an increase in the number of slaves and slave owners in 1853, the year when the Western stock markets in California were extremely strong. The rise in the number of slave owners and their enslaved property seems low, but they were more than double the previous year and signified the beginning of real investment. Additionally, while the overall tax-paying population of the county increased by 57%, the slave owner growth increased by 200%. From this point forward, slaves and slave owners continually increased. Horse and cattle declarations doubled their previous totals that very same year. The number of slave owners and slaves continued to rise within the declared livestock throughout the rest of the reported years, as they did throughout the entire frontier region, showing a clear correlation. Had the livestock industry been unsuccessful for the use of enslaved labor in a location where no cash crop agriculture existed, there would have been a decrease in one or more of those categories. My final point addresses the wealth of the smallest segment of the frontier population, the small slave owners. Seldom more than 20% of the taxpayers in each county, indeed most often 15% or less, they frequently declared 30 to 80% of the livestock in each category and land in the county and also outside of the county that they had invested in and kept. Additionally, they also declared the most land holdings in counties other than one of residents, indicating they retained that land for speculation purposes rather than needed to sell it. These statistics occur in a predictable and duplicatable patterns along the Texas frontier and in multiple interior counties that recorded low slave holdings and livestock as the chief economic engine. The advantage of slave ownership in a region where labor sources were sparse is undeniable. With fewer than 20 slaves, generally fewer than 10, stock raisers in this seemingly insignificant and omitted portion of Texas built herds and fortunes that led to the cattle barren era of the post-war drives. It is impossible to correctly assess the total wealth of these livestock raisers, the length and breadth of the state, but it was tremendous. These men and women not only surpassed the wealth of many planter contemporaries, but they lost far less of it in the post-war years when their slaves became freedmen and women. Additionally, their livelihood was happily grazing and reproducing, while planters had to replace their free labor forces and plant new crops. The microcosm of slavery that existed on the Northwestern frontier highlights the enormous wealth enslaved people generated for their owners. While the western edge of Old South may appear to be the last place to study the institution of slavery, it is ideal. Before the establishment of plantations, stockmen established microcosms of slavery in remote regions across the Old South. So while this study examines the last years of slavery, it is largely a repetition of the first. What is important is that all slave labor, in small holdings or large, be recognized and included in the history of this unjust institution. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for doing that off the cuff without a PowerPoint. It was wonderful. Our last paper this morning is from Mac Marquis, who's an environmental and labor historian. He's in his 7th year of a PhD program at the College of William and Mary. He is the book review editor for H Labor and former board member of the Southern Labor Studies Association. His focus has been on working class experiences in the Southern timber industry during Jim Crow, and his dissertation is tentatively titled Clear Cut Blues, Violence, Working Class Activism, Culture, and Labor in the Jim Crow Piney Woods. He also has a graphic history of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers under contract with the Historic New Orleans Collection. So, Mac, I don't know how you want to do this, but I'm sure you will do just fine. So we look forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. As it's been mentioned, our screen share function is inoperable at the present moment. And my presentation, just much as Deborah's was, there was an accompanying PowerPoint. And so we're going to have to go without that. But I am posting something in the chat, 2 links that I think are going to be important for the presentation and that we can still work around. So the first link is to a digital map that I've created of the dynamited dipping vats. And at some point during the talk, you can look at that map, or after the talk, what have you. And the other one is just a picture of a dipping vat, which I think is going to help a lot for this conversation. So without further ado, I want to thank everybody for attending. I also want to thank my fellow panel members for their perseverance in light of COVID and our technical difficulties. This presentation seeks to uncover the forces behind one of the largest, yet paradoxically, least known bombing campaigns in U.S. history. These bombings occurred in the Piney Woods, which is a forest of over 100 million acres that stretched from southeastern Virginia down to Florida and across to eastern Texas. In the early 20th century, the Piney Woods were sparsely populated with small homesteads of subsistence farmers. These farmers relied on the open range to supplement their diet and income, except for here, the range was not wide open prairie, but primarily forest. So throughout much of the South, the law required farmers to fence in their crops, and livestock was free to roam non-fenced areas, which were essentially a commons, regardless of whether those lands were owned by the government, private individuals, or corporations. The repeal of the Southern Homestead Act, the cutting out of the Great Lakes timber supply, the development of railroads throughout the region led timber companies to seize much of the Piney Woods, making them the largest private owners of the open range. Timber companies chewed up the forest at an incredible rate, leaving them with millions of acres of stump-ridden land that soon became a tax burden. By 1920, the South had between an estimated 76 and 92 million acres of cut-over land, which is roughly 3 times the state of Virginia. Rather than invest in wholesale reforestation, timber companies looked to unload that land by marketing it to cattle ranchers. To convert these lands into ranch land, the timber industry had to eliminate its biggest obstacle, the cattle tick. Cattle ticks carried a deadly parasite that caused a disease known as Texas fever that could kill up to 90% of profitable purebred cattle. Southern cattle, a breed referred to as scrub cattle, possess a partial immunity to the disease and, while suffering ill effects, can live with Texas fever for years. However, they remain carriers, making them mortally dangerous to the purebred cattle that timber companies needed to show could survive in the South. So efforts to eliminate the cattle tick resulted in a federal quarantine of Southern cattle and compliance with preferred method of eradication, the walking of cattle through a cement pesticide-filled trough twice a month. And that's where the link for the visual of cattle being dipped will come in handy. As the cattle tick elimination program moved from voluntary to compulsory and was associated with closures of the range, Southern herdspeople resisted through politics, courts, and ultimately extra-legally. In addition to murder, gun battles, and barn burnings, the dynamiting of dipping vats for eradication became a popular form of resistance. Between 1911 and 1936, over 1,930 dynamitings were reported throughout the South, making the bombing of dipping vats one of the largest domestic bombing campaigns in U.S. history. Although scholarship has noted that dynamiting was one of the most common forms of resistance to tick eradication, the scale of dynamiting dwarfs what scholars have thus far recorded. Indeed, the conflicts that resulted from the dipping campaign and the range closures it engendered surpass more well-known regional conflicts of the era, such as the Black Patch Tobacco War, the Johnson County Range War, and the Green Corn Rebellion, in both duration and scale. In short, this conflict was tantamount to a low-intensity war that I've termed the War for the Southern Range. This conflict did not arise out of nowhere and was preceded by native dispossession and attempts to limit African American access to the range. The Bureau of Animal Industry ran the federal government's eradication program and was publicly associated the open range with the cattle tick and marked the scrub cattle for elimination. The BAI declared that the cattle tick prevented the introduction of new and better blood with which to build up the rundown herds of the South. Blooded bulls were expensive, and farmers understood the slippery slope that purebred cattle led to fencing, because without fencing, the mating process could not be controlled. The BAI argued that unprofitable scrub and tick go together, and that only after eradication is the influx of purebred animals on a large scale possible. The Department of Agriculture's 1906 plan to eradicate the cattle tick was directly linked to range closure by the BAI chief, who declared that every county in all the infected states should have fence laws. Meanwhile, the Southern Pine Association, a timber industry heavyweight, promoted cattle ranching on cutover lands and threw its weight behind cattle tick eradication. The Southern Pine Association confirmed that it was committed to cattle tick eradication and range closure by arguing that fence laws needed enforcement, enactment, or revision to prepare for a profitable livestock industry. The impact of fences on small farmers was clear to all parties involved. In 1912, the USDA noted that an end to open grazing would create a hardship for the region's impoverished farmers who depend entirely on the open pasturage. Historians Robert Maxwell and Robert Baker asserted that timber companies were aware that attempts to close the range were virtually a declaration of war. To demonstrate the feasibility of raising purebred cattle on these lands, most timber companies began raising blooded cattle on their fenced-in, cut-over lands. And this is where I have a slide listing some of the primary timber companies that moved into cattle ranching. The raising of cattle was directly tied to dipping by the owner of the Fernwood Lumber Company, who touted that his company was the pioneer of the dipping vat idea in Mississippi. The Farmers Union responded by claiming that range closure was directly contrary to the fundamental principles of the Union, equal rights to all and special privileges to none. In other words, farmers viewed access to the open range as a fundamental right and not a privilege. A Louisiana newspaper reported that the success of fence laws was a departure from customs handed down from pioneer ancestors. So the class tensions between small farmers and ranching concerns were apparent, and they were certainly made clear by the ex-president of the Southern Cattlemen's Association with his comment that politicians who spoke directly against dipping did so to lick the boots of an unenlightened mass of illiterate voters. So to summarize, timber companies were in control of the range. They needed to unload the lands. They wanted to sell it to cattle ranchers. The obstacle was the cattle tick. Eradication of the cattle tick was tied to range closures, which hurt small farmers and also put an undue burden on them because it increased the cost of ranching with confiscated cattle. I had a slide that depicted all the complications to make it easy for us, but it unduly affected small farmers, and they were in opposition to mandatory and compulsory dipping. In 1912, Mississippi attempted to spur local governments into funding dipping programs, and this tactic was successful in moving the program forward, but it was not without opposition, as the over 480 dynamitings committed by opponents of cattle dipping in Mississippi after 1912 attests. By 1914, dynamiting was so frequent in Jones County, Mississippi, that armed guards were placed at dipping vats with order to shoot would-be dynamiters without warning. A note left behind by Mississippi dynamiters in 1914 warned that the next person to build a dipping vat would get a dose themselves. So farmers began to systematically dynamite dipping vats throughout the South as early as 1911. Dynamiters intended to end the eradication program by blowing up the vats. They simply could not be forced to dip if there were no vats to dip in. The logic is sound. Threatening farmers against the rebuilding of dipping vats was a regular occurrence. For example, the owners of 16 vats destroyed in Mauldin County, Alabama, were warned that their homes would be dynamited if the vats were rebuilt, and a note left behind by other dynamiters warned that if the dynamited vat was rebuilt, blood would flow through the streets of the town. Dynamiters occasionally timed their acts to coincide with the elections of political events that did not go their way. In the years between 1913 and 1918 inclusive, dipping opponents dynamited just over 9 vats a year in Alabama. Alabama instituted mandatory dipping in 1919, and farmers responded by blowing up 156 vats that year alone. 16 vats were blown up in Jones County when the results of a special election which approved cattle tick eradication were announced. Dynamiters acted alone and in unison. The dynamiting of 67 Shelby County, Texas vats in a single night demonstrates large coordinated effort. Similarly, 40 vats were dynamited in one night in Amite County, Mississippi, all at midnight. In another incident, in May of 1919, the Arkansas Democrat reported that 72 dipping vats were destroyed by dynamite over the course of 43 days. The U.S. government report speculated that it is reasonable to assume that this list does not include all the vats destroyed. The dynamiters in Lafayette County, Arkansas, were so thorough that they blew up almost every vat in the county. They poisoned 2 other vats and left behind a sardonic note to inform authorities that their intent had been to dynamite those vats as well. They had just run out of dynamite. So the war for the Southern Range heated up as proponents worked to protect themselves and their vats. In response to the Alabama violence, some dipping vats came to resemble armed camps replete with mounted machine guns. Things similarly came to a head in Independence County, Arkansas, where inspectors had ceased inspections and farmers were refusing to dip. The county hired new inspectors, and the first week on the job, an ambush was set for 2 of them. Both inspectors were shot and 1 was killed. Signs were posted that other inspectors could expect to be treated in the same manner. County officials responded by swearing in additional deputies, many of whom were veterans, and setting up a camp for these new sheriffs. W.A. McDonald of the Agricultural Extension Service stated that he wanted to avoid the appearance of guerrilla warfare, but that cattle must be dipped. In 1923, outside of Valdosta, Georgia, a federal employee was killed and his partner wounded after he refused to return confiscated undipped cows. In another instance, in Alabama, an Alabama woman shot and killed a tick inspector who arrived at her home to confiscate her cattle. This type of violence was extended not only to dip inspectors, but also to proponents of dipping, some of whom had their barns burned, dynamited, wells poisoned, and fields dynamited. I had a slide that listed the number of shootouts and the number of wounded and the number of dead. I think it's a couple dozen wounded over the course of these years, and over a dozen people were killed for various, be they inspectors or people confiscating cattle, some farmers as well. Ranchers who favored dipping and a wandering band of dynamiters exchanged fire one night in Monroe, Louisiana, firing over 50 rounds at one another. There were multiple occasions where saboteurs were shot and wounded and even killed during dynamiting attempts. Private detectives who were employed to infiltrate groups of dynamiters were discovered and shot in at least 2 separate instances. Newspapers reported that confrontations with dipping developed to something very much like a war condition. They were referring to an incident in which dippers and dynamiters exchanged gunfire during a failed dynamiting attempt. Widespread dynamiting abated as counties were released from quarantine, but it was not until 1944 that the federal government was able to declare victory over the cattle tick. However, the fight over the range continued for several more decades. Raising livestock was far from the only activity residents had engaged in on the open range. Hunting, fishing, and moonshining were time-honored open range activities. Hunters continued to burn the underbrush to create better conditions for hunting, but these fires sometimes escaped their intended boundaries and burned newly planted pines. By the end of the New Deal, timber companies had abandoned the longleaf pine and begun managing for the fast-growing loblolly pine. Part of this management technique included killing off stands of hardwood to promote pine growth. Unfortunately, these hardwood stands were precisely the preferred hunting grounds of local residents. Some residents responded by burning large stands of pines, and multiple notes were left behind by the arsonists in Louisiana, who stated, "You've got the money, we've got the time. You deaden the hardwoods, we'll burn the pine." This response to dispossession of a perceived right to the range mimics the bat dynamitings. Indeed, in a 1942 Forest Service study, they concluded that one of the 2 major causes of human-ignited fires on Forest Service land was in retaliation to the alleged offenses of dispossession of land and the construction of fences. Thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mac. So our comment today is from Drew Swanson, who's a professor of history at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. He's the author of 3 books on the intersections of nature and culture in the American South, most recently, Beyond the Mountains, Commodifying Appalachian Environments. And he is currently the president of the Agricultural History Society. So, Drew, over to you.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks to the audience for making an early panel, especially if you are not on Eastern time. And to the conference organizers for tackling the enormous challenges of making the shift online. I know that was a difficult thing and probably feels like unacknowledged work, but know that we appreciate the labor that you've put into this. And also to the presenters for working through the technical issues that are a part of any online conference. Y'all did a great job. This is a nicely cohesive panel, one that I'm a bit embarrassed to comment on, given how knowledgeable our panelists are and also how uniquely qualified Claire seems to be to provide feedback. Sort of feel like I'm in the wrong role here, but I'll take a stab at it. I also want to leave some time for questions from the audience. We do have a decent number of folks watching on, so I'll try to abridge my comments that I realized had grown really unwieldily long because there's so much to praise and so much interesting material here to talk about. To turn first to Erin Mauldin's presentation, Raising Animals the Right Way. What a great paper. And I'm sort of sad to hear that at the moment it stands alone. I would certainly encourage a larger project to come, although I now know that we have Claire's work to look forward to as well. So it sounds like maybe two books that could fight each other. I would strongly encourage that. Drawing on a long tradition of comparative and connective history, Mauldin's examinations of efforts to circumscribe the Southern Range and African transhumance promise, I think, to shed light on both. Regarding her comments on the post-war Southern Range, she neatly and cleverly, I think, cuts through the long-raging debate on the primary motivation for closing the range, whether it was the natural progression of intensifying agriculture, or whether it was intended as a means of racialized labor control, by observing that it could, of course, be both at once. USDA officials furnished technocratic solutions that happened to handily align with planter interests, and those planters pounced on them with visions of an agricultural New South built upon decidedly old Southern foundations. I doubt this assessment will silence the Cantor-Kuser-Hahn tussle, but it's nonetheless of note, and it changed how I think about how these issues, and I think how I will try to teach them in class as well. So it was, I know it was a quick framing of the historiography, but it was sort of breathtaking in how efficiently it bridged all of those arguments. So I deeply admire that. I do wonder about a couple of things related to cattle. One, I'm curious if it's worth noting that U.S. visions of more intensive cattle and hog husbandry still, like their African colonial counterparts, drew heavily on a British vision of rearing livestock. So I imagined echoes of Arthur Young as I read about improvements in both places. And I also thought about Rebecca Woods's argument about the wide-ranging influence of British ideas about proper breeds versus native stock. I've personally been struck with how a group of late 19th century Midwestern hog breeders that I've been looking at recently were paying more attention, it seems, to British breeds than to USDA advice on the matter. So I wonder, could the similarities in portrayals of the troublesome range in the South and Africa come as much from common antecedents as from cross-pollination? In other words, is this a decision tree or a... Of course, it could be both, but I'm curious about that. And if it matters for the story, and if so, how much? And then second, I'm curious about the degree to which language about breeds and livestock in both regions mirrored language about perceived differences in human beings. And here I think about Gabe Rosenberg's recent essay on scrub animals and similar works connecting eugenics ideas with animal breeding. Would it be productive, or do you elsewhere potentially look at the racialized language that was often deployed in critiques of landrace livestock? Turning to Deborah Liles' paper, Microcosm in Slavery, the Northwestern Frontier of Texas, I think Liles' work promises to join the growing literature on the labor of enslaved people beyond plantation margins, in industries like iron and salt, tobacco factories, oystering and fishing, the Chesapeake Bay and North Carolina's Sounds, and producing naval stores in the Carolinas and Louisiana. Taken together, all of these display, I would argue, an ancillary slave labor economy that belies any notion that the institution's death was inevitable or that its boundaries were fixed. And this is especially relevant as this talk highlights how slaveholders found profitability in bound labor in exactly the sort of arid Western environment that many pundits believed hostile to the institution. If it's not a part of the larger project, I would encourage a little more linkage to antecedent Southern husbandry practices. There's certainly a substantial body of literature on enslaved laborers in free-range cattle husbandry. I'm thinking of the work of Mark Stewart and Tim Silver and Andrew Sluter, for example, that might make interesting backstory, and maybe it's already there. And even the enormous body of work on the political economy of plantations, I think, entails discussion of the entanglements of enslavement and husbandry. So that in some ways, the Northwest Texas story that you tell seems, in some respects, fresh in its absence of plantation crops rather than in its presence of enslaved people managing cattle. And then finally, given the Elliott West quote, which I love, the environmental historian in me would like to hear more about the cattle and the weather and the grass. How did they complicate ranchers' schemes? And how did enslaved cattlemen and women acquire knowledge of these new environments or new to them? And this, I think, is especially interesting given the almost natural seeming swings in post-war cattle populations in Texas, as herds erupted, to use the wildlife biology term, and then occasionally collapsed in ways that seem to mirror wild ungulates more than any stockman's vision of husbandry. And then David Marquis, Mac's paper, The War for the Southern Range, I think is another fascinating article, building on the excellent work of our panel chair on the importance of cattle ticks in closure of the Southern Range. And keeping with my theme, I guess, for these comments, I have more cattle questions. I'm curious, Mac, if there were any concerted efforts to breed landrace cattle for further resistance to Texas fever, as well as for things like improved meat or milk. Or to put it another way, what was the agronomic justification for the insistence on importing improved breeds rather than working with the stock at hand, which had demonstrated some ability to cope with the parasite? It seems like a particularly inefficient way of tackling the problem. I found the quick mention of violent resistance in Jones County, Mississippi interesting, given its long history of resisting authority. Did you come across any efforts, any rhetoric coming out of that county to sort of link its Civil War isolationism to the struggle to prevent range closure? And then a sort of comment rather than a question. There's some interesting linkages to your points about resistance to commons limitations of all sorts in another arm of the war on Texas fever. In Florida, I believe the war on cattle ticks lasted into the 1940s, well into the 1940s, and took the late form of a sustained state effort to reduce or eradicate white-tailed deer, which served as an alternate sort of tick host reservoir in the southern half of the peninsula, even as game managers in Florida were restocking white-tailed deer in North Florida that they were bringing in, ironically, I guess, from the north. So they're doing a lot of things with deer that they were sort of trying to do with cattle, if you will. And that's interesting, I think, as it suggests that even as certain ranges like that of cattle could be closed, other ranges, other environmental ranges like the world of deer could not be in ways that complicated all of these efforts. So I think with that, I don't know if our presenters want to tackle some of these questions, and then of course, hopefully we'll have some from the audience as well.
Yeah, so why don't, does anyone want to respond to Drew's comments? I do, actually, if I may respond quickly about the British idea in Africa. One of the things I would say is that in response to animal disease, Portuguese, French, German officials are doing the same thing in their colonies that British officials are doing in theirs. So I'm not sure if that illuminates anything, but it is a cohesive approach. So.
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your comments. I feel like you pulled everything together really well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd like to bring up the environmental issues if I can. The Northwestern frontier was actually in a much better position than the southern region of Texas. During this time period, there were a lot of droughts in the southern region, and there were a few droughts in the north, but they weren't as intense as the ones in the south. And I do bring that into the larger study. But it's interesting when you have to bring that environmental aspect into the study of livestock, I think, in order to make it relevant, and in order to highlight the fact that you can't really raise stock in an open range region without considering the environment. A great example of that, of course, is the big die-off in Texas and in Kansas and in those areas when it got really cold in the 1880s, right? And they lost all that stock. And Texas was completely depleted or almost 90% depleted in the Panhandle due to that weather. Fortunately, this area did not receive the intensity that they had in the Panhandle at that time. And so a lot of these stock raisers just did really well during the antebellum years, which set them up. I've only found a few of the large cattle barons in the post-war years that weren't or who weren't slave owners, and I think that speaks volumes to how they managed their stock and how much their enslaved people contributed. So yes, thank you for your comments. I appreciate that.
I want to also thank you and thank Claire for presiding over the meeting. I think this is just a great panel. I'm honored to work with all of you. And as far as the animal husbandry, to create breeds that were that had immunity, there were attempts to do. There were all sorts of attempts to. There were attempts to do that, and there were other attempts to create or come up with, other ways to effectively eradicate the tick, or at least make it irrelevant. But none of them were particularly successful. And this, I think, also part and parcel to this was the closure of the range to introduce the stock to, and they also they needed to be able to control the breeding. And I think that was a part of it. And then as far as Florida goes, Florida, that's an interesting story. And I haven't, the eradication of the white-tailed deer, in essence, to get rid of the cattle tick, you are correct, that did last until, the 1940s. And it does bring up this interesting idea about, you can close the range for some animals, but not others. But that's perhaps part of a larger project that I might engage with later. At the moment, the project is moving toward the idea that the stockman's opposition and the violent opposition is connected to sort of a heritage of white supremacy that leaves them believing that they are indeed the inheritors of this range, and they fight that dispossession because they recognize that it means their displacement from the class, their class position.
Well, thank you. So we do have some time for questions, which is wonderful. I think I understand that the way this should work is you write your questions in the chat, and then we can go from there.
And
There
Claire,
are
a couple in the Q&A tab that have
okay, I'm in the wrong tab. Okay, let's start with the question for Deborah. You mentioned cattle raisers use more female than male slaves. What did the women do beyond normal household work, and did they contribute economically?
That question about contributing economically, I always compare slave labor to owning a company. Please don't cringe. But the secretary at the front contributes no less economically to the company than the people out working in the field. And so any person who is an enslaved person contributed economically one way or another to the household. The tendency to own female slaves more in the frontier region is basically for speculation purposes, right? Females can reproduce, and they basically could do most of the work that the men could do. There are a lot of records that show how the women were out milking the cows, processing the cows after they were killed, slaughtering not just cows but hogs also. They brought children. It didn't matter how old these children were. These children were 3 years old and up, working the stock, managing sheep. So along with the reproductive values of owning females, you also see that they could work both inside the house to help the lady of the house, and they could also work out in the fields to help tend the livestock that was owned. We don't see them going up the trails, and I think it's a different mindset. We have this vision of what a livestock business was from movies, and this notion that it was all about driving up and coming back and breaking and doing all these things. But there were many aspects, including working the crops in the fields and bringing those crops in for their owners. So it wasn't just about tending the livestock. It was also the crops that the livestock raisers grew and gravitated towards, because it went with their business, right? Corn fed both human and animal populations, as did the oats and the wheat. Thank you, Jean, for that question.
And Mac, Jean has a question for you too about your map and the blank spots on your map. What do those signify?
Sure, that's a great question. And so the map is admittedly a work in progress at this point in time. And so the way that it's been, the way that I put it together is where I have, so I don't have, no one has created a list of the dynamited dipping beds, right? Like I've done that. And so it's been hard to get verified locations for every one. A lot of the sources that I have just say that was dynamited in a particular county, right? So where I have the town location, I use the town location, the GIS coordinates. Where I don't have a town location, I use the county seat more often than not. And sometimes where I have had no location other than state, then I've used the state capital as, so this map is going to change over time as more accurate information comes in. I hope to create turn this into a public history project and create a interactive public face to where I can sort of crowdsource data, verify it, and then correct the map as we go along to make it continually more accurate as we go along. But this is to give us a rough idea of using the best and most accurate information that I currently have. So there are other plans for the map, for sure.
Kind of building off that question, Mac, I can't remember because it's been so long, but what the hell is going on in South Carolina? That there's no, there was something weird. I mean, there are many things weird about South Carolina, but there was something weird about South Carolina in the context of the story. Can you help us with that?
Sure. I currently live in South Carolina, so I'm familiar with the many things. But as far as it goes, I think that a couple things, right? One, and this is where it correlates to deforestation, more particularly into the piney woods, more specifically, right? We have to look at, so where there are large areas that are uncultivated, that are then turned into rangeland, I think is where we have, that's, so when we look at, the Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, and we look at those timberlands being turned into cattle ranching areas, I think is where we have more of the conflict. And I think that doesn't occur in South Carolina. And then also range closures happen in different, and Drew's done a lot of work on this and can perhaps speak more to it, but range closures happen in different ways, right? Like we tend to, people have argued with me that, well, range closure doesn't happen until, 1930, or 1940 in, some of these states. So, but range closure happens it's incremental, right? It doesn't happen all at once. It happens on a municipal level. it happens on a county level, and then it happens on a state level. And then there's various types of range closures as those laws are being enacted, right? And so one is the type of fence, right? A fence might be constructed to allow sheep to pass through, but not cattle. So there's different types of range closures. And I think that that's what's happening in South Carolina. And I think that that's, it is something that I have to do more work on to get more accurate information. But my understanding is that that's what's happening in South Carolina. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you. Erin, we got a bunch of questions for you and some for Deborah. Erin, do you want to tackle Becca's question or Deborah's question? What tickles your
I think
fancy
I can do
here?
all of them pretty quickly. Okay, so let's start with Deborah's question. Thanks. I was just looking it up, and yeah, so there was a recorded outbreak in Texas of hog cholera in 1853. And then there was 2 more. Well, there were a lot during the war. And you see that in the war, the official records of the War of the Rebellion. And you can just do a text search for hog cholera, and it's there. And then I was looking, and the Bureau of Animal Industry reported another 7 counties in the late 1860s reporting hog cholera outbreaks, and then 2 really bad outbreaks in the 1970s. And that's as far as sort of my quick little search right now looked at. But yeah, I mean, essentially, hog numbers suffered obviously during and after the war, and they didn't really rebound like you would expect. And part of that was hog cholera, but not all. Outbreaks could be limited geographically depending on the ability of hog raisers to take care of it, or, entire herds would, die. And then you would have to replace them. What was I going to say? Yeah. So, and then Cindy has a question about the enclosure movement meant to protect livestock from exposure to disease, but animals impact enclosures are really vulnerable to disease, which is more dangerous. Well, see, that's the irony, really, is that hog cholera and some of these other diseases spread less effectively when animals are on the open range. When you put them in enclosures, these viruses can stay in the soil, depending on the temperature. They can stay in the water, the secretions of other animals for months at a time. And so actually enclosures often are worse for the spread of these diseases than using open range animal or free range animal grazing. And how does it relate to the current anti-vax conflict? I have not thought about that. But I mean, obviously the rhetoric over sort of the resistance to mask mandates and things like that, I think probably relates more closely to Mac's work than mine. So maybe he has something to say about that.
So I have thought quite a bit about it, because it's something that it's been very tempting to reframe my work in light of the, our current pandemic, because I think there are things to say. And one is how the quarantine is enacted, and to show that, where it's, that it has to be what took, they kept billing this to farmers as something that within a year or two, your county could be free. If you dipped, your county could be free of the cattle tick. But the problem was the enforcement of that, and the dynamiting of dipping bats meant that they would spend money on this. Some counties were, this would go on and on and on for years. And then also, if the other counties around you did not enforce the quarantine and still had open range, it meant that your county then could be continually reinfected as cattle came back in, crossed over the county line. So there's all sorts of parallels with that. In terms of the opposition to the vaccination, I mean, part of it is, for me, as I said, I do think that there is this this idea that the range, the small farmers and herds people of the Piney Woods believed that they were the inheritors of this range, that this range was their birthright, that they, this was fundamental to their liberty, that they have access to this range. And I think that that's part of why they resisted so virulently. They saw this as being, as their dispossession of this was them being the protection of white supremacy now was no longer being applied to them. And I say white supremacy because of the native dispossession and the white supremacist ideas behind native dispossession, and also attempts to limit African American access to the range during Reconstruction and afterwards. We're all part and parcel, right? And so I think that is also tied up in this, and there's parallels to be drawn to the current situation through that. And I would say, just piggybacking on Erin's comments to Cindy, I would also say that there are the enclosure movement now animals protect. So it's also not either or, right? It doesn't have to be the open range or crowded crowded livestock raising areas, right? There's other hybrid. There's open pasture where animals can range on acres and acres and acres, but it's not necessarily it's not open range, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily be in either or, but certainly the current situation is, as I echo Erin's comments, that the current situation is definitely more dangerous than the open range.
So Deborah, we have a couple of minutes. Maybe you can respond to Randall's question.
I can. So it's basically planters. The cattle they had was for consumption on the plantation, and although they did often participate in the livestock trade, they had a tendency to sell it off for a purpose. So when they refugeed into Texas, which was basically during the last 2 years of the war, the stock they brought with them was most often brought for consumption, and they weren't actively trading in the market. What you find are the small slave owners selling to the planters, just like they did from the upper South to the lower South. The livestock raisers sold down to the South, as that a lot of that land was used in the South for cash crop agriculture. You'll see the same thing with the refugee planters coming in. One, for example, is a great example, is Worthington, who came in from Arkansas, and he came in, I believe, with 167 slaves, and he brought livestock with him. I know, can you imagine bringing all those slaves and livestock at the same time? I can't imagine what that looked like. But it was basically any kind of livestock they brought with them was for consumption. Thank you for your question.
I think we're nearly out of time here. Now I've lost the questions. There was one more question. Cindy wants to know if the fencing in itself helped the lumber companies, because if the fences were made of wood.
Not particularly. Just to be brief, by the 20s, people were moving toward barbed wire, and in the earlier years, people were using a lot of these small farmers. They didn't really think twice about getting material from, they're harvesting on the open range on timber companies' land to get materials for the fencing. That was something that would be quite common. And they also, some of them, they usually had a couple acres of their own land as well. So I wouldn't say that the timber companies profited from that in any way.
If I can add to that, in the antebellum years, a lot of the fences were bodark. Fences. They would sell the bodark seeds, and then they would create fences around a lot of the land to keep anything in or out.
And in Africa, they used sisal plants to make fences, and in Madagascar, prickly pear cactus. Who knew?
Yeah.
So,
Osage orange
right.
in Ohio and Indiana.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you all for a wonderful session. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was so nice to see you all. I'm so sorry we can't be in New Orleans, but I think the organization has done a great job with this very quick transfer, and excellent papers, wonderful comments. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Just like the backstage area.
Yeah.
Hang out.
I do want to give a brief, I appreciate everyone so much for being on the panel, and also, for persevering through the technical difficulties, the pandemic, what have you. It's been great.
Yeah, it has been really good. And Erin, I was so interested in your stuff given my new work on Africa. So that was really interesting.
Well, I'm so glad you have that project on the boil, because there's definitely something there. And, I'm just so terrified of wandering into, histories that I don't know enough about to really.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's terrifying. I just finished, I'm on sabbatical. I just finished reading like 300 articles on Africa. Mm-hmm. And then I realized I had actually no idea of the general history of Africa. So then I had to go back and start reading like a history of South Africa, a history of Central Africa. So yeah, it's been a whole production.
But to one of Drew's comments, about sort of racialized understanding of both people and animals. Like you see that rhetoric a lot coming from colonial officials, and then whites in the South talking about freed people. It's also interesting about this enclosure thing and Cindy's question. I mean, one of the things that the Africans did a lot was what was called sissa, and that was when they would kind of lend their cattle to somebody else. And then that person could profit from their cattle, have the milk, sometimes have the babies, and the owner would get free labor. And so the chiefs would often sissa cattle all over the place. And one of the other effects of sissoring cattle was it moved the cattle into different ecosystems. And so if there was a disease outbreak, it would be only some of their animals would be affected. And then as the Africans got concentrated on reserves, the impact of all of the diseases were much worse. Yeah. No, that's the irony, is that sort of this idea, and a lot of it does come down from sort of like British agricultural reform in the 1700s, like this idea that, enclosing animals and having different sorts of batter breeds, this intensive sort of static stock raising was somehow more civilized, often exacerbated a lot of these diseases, regardless of what disease you're talking about.
Well, and even when Africans embraced things like inoculation against rinderpest or dipping against East Coast fever, the veterinary services usually couldn't afford to treat the number of animals that the Africans had. So they would be like, no, we can't afford it. You just have to keep in quarantine, and we'll just help the white settlers. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like some of the comments of the colonial officials, just about the ways that they talked about Africans sort of receiving this advice, or the way that Africans were reacting to preventative slaughter. I mean, the arrogance and just the misunderstandings there it's astounding, But.
Well, and they were paying white settlers when they slaughtered their cattle, but they rarely paid the Africans when they
there
slaughtered.
was no compensation. Yeah.
So.
No, it's fun talking to somebody else who's read this stuff.
It is. Well, and you're so close. We could actually talk in person.
Oh yeah, that's true. Although, I've lived in Florida for almost 4 years now, and I still haven't been to Orlando.
Well, that's just a shame. We need to remedy that.
Is it?
I was just jealous of all of you down south. I had to slip out and get my coat because I guess they have not turned the heat on in my office this morning. It's like in the 20s.
Yeah, no, we're finally having nice weather.
Yeah, it's lovely. Mm-hmm. I haven't turned the AC on yet this morning.
Yeah, we're still in shorts and t-shirts, but it's not 90 anymore.
Right.
I had to turn my heater on this morning because it was low 40s. So
Man.
in Texas.
Yeah, it's been getting in the 40s here at night, but it's still not really enough to crank the heat on.
Yeah, I have to go to Richmond next week for a talk, and I realized I don't have any seasonally appropriate clothing. I don't know what
I'm
to do
heading
anymore if I'm not in like a t-shirt.
we're heading to Utah on Monday for some hiking, and I'm like, okay, please tell me I have some sweaters from my Fargo days that I can dig out.
Yeah.
So
Well, thank y'all.
All right. Well, it was good to see
thank you guys.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Drew.
Bye.